All right, good morning, everyone. Folks are continuing to join. Thanks for joining us this morning. Just a few announcements as everyone gets connected. First, I just want to make sure everyone knows that the session is being recorded and it will be available within the next 2 weeks here in the Whova app, and it will be available for 6 months following Congress. So if you want to come back to the content, that is definitely a wonderful way to review what you learned today. If you have any questions for our speakers, please be sure to add to the Whova chat to the right of your viewing window. Either in the Q&A or the chat, we'll make sure that our moderator, Andrew, gets those questions, and we'll squeeze in as many as we can. And then we kindly ask you to keep your microphones and cameras off during the presentation, unless the presenter asks you to join and turn a camera or microphone on. It looks like we're ready to get started. And so, Andrew, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to you to kick things off. And we can see, there you go. No, I can see you, but we've lost your audio.
How about, can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can hear you. You're all set.
Okay, excellent. Welcome everyone. Thank you for coming to our special session. I'm going to be really brief here to keep us on schedule. This meeting is, or this special session is titled Wilderness for Science, Multidisciplinary Perspectives on the Causes and Consequences of Active Fire Regimes. And really what we are all about today is trying to take a look at all of the scientific advances that have been enabled through wilderness fire management programs. So places on the landscape where fire is allowed to fulfill its role as a natural ecosystem process. To start us off, we've got Dr. Sean Parks from the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute with the Rocky Mountain Research Station. And with that, I'm just going to turn it over to Sean and get us going.
Hello, everybody. Good to see you, although I can't see you, but thanks for joining.
Sean, we can see, oh, there you go. Now your slide's connected.
We're good. Okay, great. Yeah, thanks everyone for joining us. I'm excited to share this presentation with you, and also just this special session in general is I'm pretty excited about it. As Andrew mentioned, I work for the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Research Institute. And today I'm going to be talking, about wilderness for fire science and what we've learned from wilderness in terms of how fire behaves. And I do want to point out that I'm really focusing on projects and studies that I've led or co-led over the last several years. And I apologize for that, but there's just not time to get into everybody's stuff. That's why we're having this special session. So there's been a lot of great wilderness fire science over the years, but again, I'm just going to touch on what I've been working on and just scratch the surface of everything. I don't have time to get really deep on these specific projects. So why wilderness? First of all, there's lots of reasons why we'd want to study fire in wilderness. One being that there's no roads. Roads can impede the spread of fire, number one, and also facilitate fire suppression. So if you want to study fire, if you want fire to behave, quote unquote, naturally, wilderness is a good place to do it. Same thing, there's no mechanical fuel treatments or logging, so we don't have some of these intensive land uses you see on the top right in this photo that would alter fire behavior. No salvage logging, again. And then perhaps most importantly, that there are some wilderness areas that have programs that allow fires to burn and have had these programs since the 1970s or 1980s. And what's missing from wilderness, of course, is the human ignitions, right? Historically, prior to European American colonization of the United States, there were a lot of human ignitions and indigenous fire. We are missing that, and I will totally admit that for sure. But I'll still argue that compared to some of these more managed landscapes, the top right, for example, and that fires are acting, quote unquote, in their natural fire regime or their natural habitat. And the absence of fire suppression, or the reduced fire suppression anyway, is really helpful for studying fire in its natural habitat. And because fires are allowed to burn in a handful of wilderness areas, and because they're remote, we have some really deep fire history in some of these areas. And if you want to study fire, you go where the fire is, right? And so we have a lot of fire, a lot of good fire, or just a lot of fire in these wilderness areas. So a lot of the studies I'm going to show today are focused on these wilderness areas. The Wood Buffalo National Park is actually in Canada. It's not technically a wilderness area because it's, in Canada, but they have a fire use program. Actually, only one of the studies includes Wood Buffalo National Park. The majority of the studies I'm going to show are these 4 Western US wilderness areas, or protected area complexes. There's the Crown of the Continent ecosystem, which is Glacier National Park and Bob Marshall Wilderness, and some other adjacent wilderness areas south of there. There's Selway Bitterroot Wilderness in central Idaho, the Frank Church Wilderness, or the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness in central Idaho, and the Gila and Aldo Leopold Wilderness areas in New Mexico. So when you have a lot of fire over multiple years, one other thing I want to point out is that when you do have these fire use programs, you're also fires are also burning under less than extreme weather conditions. A lot of the fires outside of wilderness, because of the intense and effective fire suppression, are only burning under extreme weather conditions. So to have fires burning under less than extreme weather conditions provides more opportunities to study fire under different conditions. So one of the questions we've asked, or one of the broader questions we've been asking, is about the mosaic of previously burned areas. And we've got, all these fires that have occurred. So how do they affect the next fires that come around? And when you're thinking about these previously burned areas, there's a lot of like sub questions you can ask. And so one of these questions is how do these previous fires limit the spread or size of subsequent fires? Or basically, do fires act as a fuel break for the next fires that come around? So these are fires that are starting outside. So this 2003 fire started outside of these previous fires. And the question is, do the previous fires act as a fuel break? Another question you can ask is just about ignitions. Do fires start inside of previous fires, or are they less likely to start inside of recent previous fires, or are they more likely to start outside of fires where we don't have any fire history? Although that area burned at some point in the past, we recognize that. So this is asking the question about, do fires start inside of perimeters? So on the left, we're asking about fires that start outside of previous fires and spreading in. On the right, we're asking about fires that start within these previously burned areas. And then when you think about this, there's actually a combined or cumulative effect, and you get potentially a reduction in the overall probability of fire. So the two top ones, lead to this cumulative effect, an overall reduction in the probability of fire. So we've asked each of these questions in these 4 Western US wilderness areas, and the last one includes Wood Buffalo National Park in Canada. So the first question about looking at whether or not fires act as a fuel break or spread or stop fire spread or size, the answer is yes. And but there's this idea that these previous fires don't stop fires in perpetuity, right? There's like a sunset date on their effectiveness. So what you see is immediately after the fire, this y-axis, the vertical axis here, is showing, basically whether or not a previous fire acts as a fuel break, the probability of it. So you have high probabilities that previous fires are going to stop a subsequent fire immediately after that fire burns, and then that effectiveness diminishes over time, and the effectiveness, the dashed line here represents when we consider that effect more or less negligible. So the effect lasts about 6 years in the Gila and Aldo Leopold wilderness areas, and between 15 and 17 years in those other 3 wilderness areas in the Western US. So the next question, thinking about ignitions, about whether or not fires start within previous perimeters, we've taken that on. And we used a pretty cool statistical approach here called survival analysis that I'm definitely not going to get into, but it's a very cool statistical approach, and you create something called the hazard ratio. If you have a hazard ratio below 1, it means that fires are less likely to start in these previous burns. And so you can see that again, immediately after a fire, the hazard ratio is, approaching 0, which means fires are much less likely to start in these previous burns. But the hazard ratio approaches 1 and reaches 1 between 9 and 25 years, depending on the study area. So as long as the hazard ratio is below 1, previous fires are less likely to start within these previous burns. So let's go to the third question we were asking about the overall reduction in the probability of fire. Again, we use this survival analysis, and we have the hazard ratio. So low values means areas are less likely to reburn. There's a resistance to reburn, basically, immediately after a fire. And that resistance to reburn, diminishes or becomes weaker as time goes on. So you can see that the different study areas, once it approaches 1, that effect is gone. That resistance is gone, basically. So you can see that the different study areas show different resistances. The Gila and Aldo is the warmest and driest study area. So it always has, more of a ponderous alpine frequent fire system. So it always has you always see the effect of fire being weaker or diminishing faster in the Gila and Aldo Leopold wilderness areas. I want to point out 2 things real quick here. We do see fires that are reburning. People will point out, oh, the Dixie fire reburned. I think it reburned the Moonlight fire and some other fire this year in California. And I want to point out that our results don't say that fires aren't going to burn a previously burned area. It's a probability, right? It might be less probable, but it doesn't mean it's impossible. So it's so fires can reburn areas, and they do, and sometimes very, very short. Sometimes there's very short interval reburns. So I think it's important just to remember that this is a probability, not like an absolute dichotomous outcome. The second point I want to make is that, and the Dixie fire is a great example. The Dixie fire reburned several fires this year. That when fires burn under these extreme weather conditions, you might expect the effectiveness of previous burns in resisting fire are weaker, and we've actually studied that as well in this particular study that I'm showing. We looked at we looked at how the resistance to reburn varies as a function of the Palmer Drought Severity Index. The Palmer Drought Severity Index negative values are very dry and hot. And 0 is average. The PDSI of 0 is like an average year. So what we see here is that when the Palmer Drought Severity Index is low or negative, we have very dry conditions, and the resistance to reburn is less strong. Basically, fires are less and diminishes faster, I guess. So that's what we expect to see. It's kind of common sense. We're seeing it out in the world. We're seeing it in the data here. So just remember that extreme weather conditions play a pretty big role. And then what about when areas do reburn? What happens? We've studied that in the Frank Church Wilderness and then the Gila and Aldo Leopold wilderness areas. We just looked at areas that reburn and areas that did not reburn, and we see a reduced severity in areas that have had fire previously versus areas that have had a longer fire-free period. So this effect lasts at least 20 years. I will admit that this is probably where a lot more research needs to occur. We're seeing there's a lot of great research out there already that Michelle Copoletta, Zach Steele had a project or a presentation earlier this week that shows that if the first fire is severe, you have a different outcome than if the first fire is low severity. So the severity of those initial fires matters a lot. And so some of the short interval fires we're seeing are very bad actually, and are causing conversions from forest to non-forest. So I don't want this to come across as saying, you know, all reburns are good. They're not. But this is just what we have. This is what we showed in this study, and I think a lot more work can be done in this domain. Another study that we basically asked, where do fires stop and why do they stop? You know, what impedes fire spread? And this is one of my favorites actually. It was led by Lisa Holsinger, where we looked at each fire in these wilderness areas, and we measured, you know, using remote sensing and GIS data along the perimeter. We measured fuels, topography, and the daily weather, and we compared it to these interior points, what we called core points. So you might expect that these are where the fires could have stopped at these core points, but the fire didn't stop. So we asked the question whether there are different fuels, weather, topographic conditions where the fires stopped versus where it didn't stop. And fuels did include previous burns, and also NDVI. And here we show that fuels was on average the highest or the most important factor in impeding fire spread. So previous fires in low fuels, as measured by NDVI, is where fires stopped. And weather was the second biggest factor, and topography was the least important factor on average. So for example, for weather, the daily temperature on the day the fire stopped was on average lower than the daily temperature for those core points when the fire was actively spreading. I'm going to switch gears here and talk about really big regions like the Western US, and how we can use wilderness areas and protected areas or data from these areas to make inferences over these broader landscapes. Gosh, I'm running out of time. So anyway, it turns out that if you, in each of these hexels, these are called hexels. There's your 500 square kilometer hexels. In each of these, we can calculate the percent or the area burned. We can calculate the climate is shown on the left. We can calculate the percent protected, and we can calculate the mean fire severity. Turns out if you build a model using all the hexels in the Western US, the model is not good at all. It's interesting. But if you build a model using only these hexels that have a high proportion of protected, you actually start to build a decent model, and you can, of say, area burned as a function of climate. And what we concluded basically is that the relationship between climate and fire decouples in areas of high human impact. So because you have strong relationships within the protected areas, but weak relationships outside. So using data from basically protected areas, just these blue hexels over here, for example, we built a model of area burn as a function of these several climate variables. When you compare, you could use that model to predict how much expected area burn there is everywhere, even outside of these blue hexels. Then you can compare your predicted area burned to your observed area burned, and that gives you an idea of fire departures. So again, if you have less fire than you might expect, less fire than the model predicts, you would have a fire deficit. If you have more fire than the model predicts, you have a fire surplus. And so the blue area shows the fire deficit. If we were to overlay a map of forest on here, you'd show that the forest in the blue areas line up almost perfectly. So forested areas have a pretty big fire deficit based on this model, and the red areas show fire surplus. A lot of these big red areas are sagebrush, high desert and sagebrush areas that have been invaded by cheatgrass. So we have a lot of fire. In Southern California, we have invasive species and a lot of human ignitions. I'm going to wrap this up. And another thing, we've used that same framework using the data within the wilderness areas and protected areas to build models of fire severity under future time periods and contemporary time periods, so we can make inferences on expected changes in fire severity. And lastly, the fire science, wilderness fire science continues. Melissa Jaffe is going to be giving a presentation later today. She spent a lot of time in the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness. There's Andrew Larson on the right. And I encourage you again to, you know, if you're interested in fire, you go where the fire is. So we've seen a lot of fire in wilderness. So it's a great place, but it's very challenging if you want to do some field work. And you can see here that's very steep and very smoky. So with that, I'm going to end. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Sean. It looks like we are right at time, so we're going to hold questions for now. I'll mention that at the end of our second session, we do have a block of time reserved for discussion, so there'll be an opportunity to engage with the speakers then if we don't get questions in now. So thanks for that, Sean. Gabrielle, if you want to go ahead and load up your screen and we'll move on to our next speaker. So our next speaker is Gabrielle Boisrame. Gabrielle is with the Desert Research Institute, and she'll be speaking about snowpack, soil moisture, and stream flow in Sierra Nevada watersheds with frequent fire.
Hello, I'm Gabrielle Boisrame. I'm an assistant research professor at the Desert Research Institute in Nevada, and I'll be talking about research on snowpack, soil moisture, and stream flow in 2 Sierra Nevada watersheds with frequent wildfire. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about fire history in the Sierra Nevada mountains. I'll talk specifically about Illilouette and Sugarloaf Creek basins, especially their fire history, and discuss some observed and modeled effects of fire we've seen in these watersheds in terms of stream flow, snowpack, soil moisture, and drought resilience. These 2 watersheds are really unique natural laboratories to study natural fire regimes, because even though, like much of the Sierra Nevada, they were fire suppressed for about 100 years, in the 1970s, the Park Service decided that they were going to allow lightning-ignited fires to burn through these watersheds in an effort to restore more natural ecosystems. And research has shown that the post-1972 fire return intervals are similar to pre-suppression intervals. So the wildfire regimes in these 2 watersheds are pretty similar to what they were prior to fire suppression. So they give us this really unique ability to look at what a natural fire regime would do to the forests and to the hydrology within a watershed in Sierra Nevadas. One of the first things that we did was looking just at Illilouette Creek Basin, which is in Yosemite National Park. We have this really long stream flow record, and we're able to compare stream flow from before and after fire was reintroduced to this landscape and compare it to a few other watersheds. And when we looked at the runoff ratio, which is the ratio of stream flow to precipitation in a given water year, there was no significant difference in between the 2 periods. But if you looked at 3 nearby watersheds with similar lengths of records, they all saw a decrease in that runoff ratio. And so we would expect that, all other things being equal, we would have also seen a decrease in the Upper Merced watershed, which contains Illilouette, but we did not. So really the return of fires may be preserving that stream flow, keeping it from decreasing as is happening in the other watersheds. We wanted to collect more data to look at the mechanisms of what's happening in this watershed. So we hired a mule team, packed them up with weather station pieces, went out during different times of year, and got some measurements of snow, including in climbing up into trees to install some cameras up high. Also installed these weather stations to collect a lot of different micrometeorological data. And we got some pretty interesting results. One clear one is that both in Yosemite and in Sequoia Kings Canyon, when we looked at 3 adjacent patches that were very similar topographically but had different vegetation cover post-fire, in the opened areas such as wetlands and shrub fields, snow persisted a lot longer. and got deeper than in densely forested sites that were more like an unburned site. Here's a video to show an example of two sites. On the top, we have a dense forest site. You can see it's melting much faster. And in the burned forest, where the canopy is much more open, the snow sticks around a lot longer. This snowpack in turn affects the soil moisture. Here you can see continuous soil moisture measurements that we have in Sugarloaf. At top you see we have a wetland site, and of course it stays wetter than the shrub and forest sites. And a lot of that is due to the snow adding a lot of water, and that water sticks around long into the summer. And you can see in the forest site on the bottom, right after snow melt finishes, it dries up a lot faster, possibly because the trees are using up a lot of water, also because the snow did not stick around for as long and was not as deep to really fill up those soil moisture stores. See similar things in Illilouette Creek Basin in Yosemite. The wetland burned site stays wet a lot longer, and the trees and shrubs are a little more similar in this one, but you can see that under the trees it's drying up a lot faster in the summer compared to the shrub site, and the Yosemite site did burn in 2017, and so we have before and after fire soil moisture. And we can see in the shrub site, which burned pretty severely in 2017, it did start to dry up a little bit faster in that first year following the fire, but then it stayed more similar to the forested site. And this is in the shallow soil moisture. And another interesting thing to see is in the wetland, we have this 2019 year, which was, somewhat average, slightly on the wet side. You can see that the area stayed pretty much saturated at the surface that entire year, compared to other years it had dried out in the summer. And so we can't say for sure that that's because of the fire that had happened a couple of years before, but it could be that the fires had an effect. If we look down at 1 meter deep in the shrub site, which again have burned pretty severely at the end of water year 2017, we see a few telling differences that again we can't be sure are from the fire, but are pretty suggestive. You can see the first summer after the fire, we see a faster drawdown of that deep soil moisture. But then in the following years, you can see 2019 was less wet than 2017, but the ground stayed wetter through the summer, possibly because it was post-fire, less transpiration happening. And also think about in 2019, 2020, shrubs are starting to grow back a little bit. So we have some shading, which might be keeping it from having the issue of that early summer drawdown of soil moisture that we saw in 2018, the first year after the fire. So it looks like initially fire may have dried this site out a little bit, but then after a couple years of growing back, it's staying wetter than it might have been before that fire came through and we had really dense shrubs growing there. Now, in order to look more closely at actual mechanisms, we did computer modeling, where we start the model in 1970, which is after about 100 years of fire suppression, when we had really dense forest cover on this landscape, and then run two model scenarios. One where there are no fires, so the vegetation stays the same, and then in scenario 2, try and reproduce the actual fires and vegetation transitions as accurately as possible compared to what happened in reality, and compare the model output, and the difference between the two scenarios should give us the effect of the fires themselves. And what we saw is that we have about a 3% increase in stream flow, which is Q in the water balance equation shown here, And that's caused by about a 4% decrease in evaporation and a 25% decrease in transpiration. So mostly caused by removing water use by plants. And we see differences between wet and dry years. If you look at snow water equivalent in the watershed, you see in wet years, you get more snow, wet years and dry years, you get more snow accumulating in the burned watershed into the winter. But in a wet year, you lose some of that snowpack into the spring, possibly because there's more snow at lower elevations where it's getting warmer and there's less canopy cover to protect the snowpack. But in dry years, perhaps when more of your snow is up at higher elevations, you keep that deeper snowpack into the spring. And in a dry year, maximizing your snowpack into the spring like that is especially helpful. In terms of stream flow, we also see that the increase in stream flow is greater in wet years than in dry years. And that's because you get this huge drop in evapotranspiration in the wet years. When there is a lot of extra water in the dry years, the system is more water limited, so the trees are going to be using up pretty much all the water that is available, so you don't get as much of a decrease when you thin out the trees with fire. This also leads to a big decrease in climatic water deficit in dry years. Again, there's not a lot of water deficit, so you see water shortage for the trees in the wet years to begin with, so there's not a lot to lose. But then in dry years, even though you're not decreasing evapotranspiration that much, it's making a huge difference to the drought stress on the trees. Another thing we looked at is spatially distributed soil moisture. In Lillooet Creek Basin, we can see that in places that were conifer forest in the 1970s, and then by 2014, when we took measurements to constrain the model, if they had transitioned to dense meadow, you got a big increase in the volumetric water content labeled as VWC here. And so all these places we saw that converted from conifer to dense meadows or wetlands, we had a pretty big increase in soil moisture according to the model that we fit to measurements. We didn't see as much of a change in Sugarloaf Creek Basin. You can see even in places that were conifers and transitioned to dense meadow, mostly we think they were pretty wet to begin with, and maybe moisture has increased slightly since that transition, but not as much. And basically, you see this, we have our unburned scenario on the x-axis, burned on the y-axis, and there's not a huge difference between the two for any of these vegetation types. And that's probably partly because Sugarloaf is more water limited. It's a drier area than a Lillooet Creek Basin. And so we don't get as much of a decrease in transpiration. When you thin out the trees, you don't get as much of a change in your water balance. And you don't store a lot more water in the soil just because there's not a lot of extra water available when the forests thin out, fires thin out the trees. One other thing that we looked at directly was forest health. So increasing water availability in the soil, of course, can reduce drought mortality. And that was a big issue during the drought years of 2014, 2015, especially. And when we looked at Forest Service data over Lillooet Creek Basin from those years, we saw that within Lillooet Creek, we saw almost no tree mortality related to the drought. That's these solid polygons. But right outside of the watershed, we saw some pretty large patches of drought mortality. And you can also see in other areas that had burned, these areas, the crosshatching outside of the watershed, they hadn't observed a lot of drought mortality either. So places that burned, it looks like the trees that did remain were a lot healthier and able to resist that 2014 drought that killed so many trees in the Sierra Nevadas. And we didn't see much of the same effect in Sugarloaf, probably again because Sugarloaf is a lot drier and the fires were not able to add enough water to the system to make a big difference. So in conclusion, restoring fire to these landscapes has increased their snowpack and increased stream flow, at least in Illilouette Creek Basin, where we have stream flow measurements to compare. On average, it's increased soil moisture, more so in the wetter Illilouette Creek Basin, and reduced drought stress, again, more so in Illilouette compared to Sugarloaf. And looking at hydrologic effects of fire is really important because the Sierra Nevada provides most of California's water. So we really need to pay attention to what's happening in these mountain watersheds. And also, of course, fire is ubiquitous on this landscape. Snowpack is also very vulnerable to climate change. And the drought stress on trees is also increasing with climate change. And so returning wildfires to these areas where it can be done safely and naturally might help to mitigate some of these climate change effects. I'd like to thank the Park Service and my sponsors and all the many research assistants who helped to make this possible. Any questions?
Thanks, Gabrielle. We'll give folks here, we have plenty of time for questions. And so while folks are getting those into Whova, I'll start us off if nobody else beats me to it. So I'm really intrigued by the slide you showed of the conifer to dense meadow transition and the really striking change in, I think it was volumetric soil water content. And I'm curious about your interpretation of that. Were those, do you think, reversions from maybe wet meadows in the past that had been invaded by conifers? Or what do you think drives that big shift? Oh, looks like you're muted, Gabrielle.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I found this really interesting as well. And of course, these are mostly modeled numbers and they're based on field measurements that we made, but we don't have field measurements of the soil moisture from back before any fires came through. But the model does seem to perform pretty well. And yeah, I do think that what's happening is that in a lot of these places where you had really high soil moisture after conversion to dense meadow, I think those were already somewhat wetter places on the landscape, possibly had been meadows before, but then got encroached by trees. And then that keeps up sort of a cycle. If there's a slightly drier period and trees get encroached, then those trees use a lot of water and they keep the soil moisture low. And then once you remove them, the moisture can build back up and then maybe keep saplings from establishing again. Yeah, so that's basically what we found from this study. It seemed like topography was sort of the most important thing in driving where moisture was, but there were places where trees had potentially encroached, and when you remove those trees, then that allowed moisture to increase if it was topographically favorable for it. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thanks for that. We've got about 1 minute left. And in that time, I think I'd love to hear more on the snow component. That really jumped out at me as both this piece that you started with and the model differences where you were showing, I think, later snow melt in the dry years, possibly driven by elevation. But the canopy effects are particularly striking. We just have 1 minute, so maybe some quick commentary on that would be wonderful.
Yeah, and I realized that the video didn't quite work right before, so I'll just play it again right now.
Oh.
If you're seeing that, yeah. So basically, these are two sites really close together, a few hundred meters apart. And you can see under the forest, it's melting out a lot faster in the spring. And then basically in places that are really close to the freezing point during the winter, the energy balance is really important to determining whether you're gonna keep your snow on the ground or not. And the trees themselves basically reflect long wave radiation, sort of the tree well effect. And so the way the energy balance works out in this particular area is that if you have more trees, they actually provide more energy to the snowpack than if it was just open to the sky and to the sun. And so the trees themselves are helping to melt the snow. There's also some interception of snow in the trees, but I think it's mostly this energy thing of the radiation reflecting off the trees and the trees themselves causing the snow to melt.
Excellent. All right, our time is up. Thank you, Gabrielle. That was an awesome presentation. We're going to switch to our next speaker, Greg Jacobs. And while Greg gets slides up, I'll just give a quick introduction. Greg is going to be speaking to us about debris flows and the link between wildfire and salmon spawning habitat in the Middle Fork Salmon River in central Idaho.
Cool. Thank you, Andrew. Everything look good for the presentation here?
Yep, looks great.
Sweet. Oh boy. I have my monitor. I have it on the other monitor, so sorry if you get my profile view here. I'm interested in fire as one variable among many that influence stream fish habitat and population dynamics. And in that sense, I think I might have a slightly different perspective than many of the other speakers here. I hope that's useful. I think it's going to be very useful for me. I have two hopes in my participation here. One, I hope to learn something more about my system like this by confronting my results with your expertise. That's very beneficial. And I also want to, I think this can help motivate some additional synthetic landscape ecology science to better interrogate the relationship between fishes and other stream biota and fire. Not that there's been no work done, but I think there's an opportunity to do some good large scale work with this, with sort of a burgeoning availability of biological data sets and other landscape variables. Anyway, off the soapbox, I guess. Boom. And then he tried to advance the slide. So I don't need to tell anyone here that wildlife is a landscape feature, but I just want to present it as such, and in parallel with streams as a landscape feature, and especially streams as a dynamic mosaic of landscape feature heterogeneity. And fires are a very important component of that. And because they're an important component of that, fires and their influence on other variables in the system, including stream flow variables, hydrogeomorphic variables, riparian vegetation variables, other biota, they're part of the mix and part of what I'm interested in when I'm interested in fish. So I have sort of a general question, which is, are fires good for fishes and why? And so we do know some things about that, at least about the relationship between fire and streams. And, I don't want to jump the gun too much because I think the next talk here is going to interrogate that link a little bit more. What I'm interested in, among many different influences fire may have on streams, including changes in water quality, changes in riparian function, I also want to think about debris flows, which is the contribution of sediments and woody debris from the landscape that's loosened up from the landscape, if you will, and contributed into streams where some of the substrate sizes or woody debris availability may be more limiting. I'm going to talk about Chinook salmon today, and which is sort of an interesting conservation study animal. They're an endangered species. I'm talking about Snake River spring Chinook salmon, specifically Snake River spring Chinooks that spawn in the Middle Fork Salmon River in central Idaho. These fish, just to give a quick crash course in their life history, they're highly migratory. The Middle Fork Salmon River and other inland streams like it offer spawning habitat and rearing habitat for these fish. They migrate after rearing to the Pacific Ocean, and of course must sort of go through the gauntlet of environmental stressors through the through the migratory corridor in the Snake and Columbia rivers, and also in the Pacific before coming back to spawn as adults. They spawn as adults in the Middle Fork and then die, completing their life cycle. Environmental drivers affect all phases of their life history. So you could pick and choose, but I'm going to focus on what drives spawning and rearing habitat quality in the Middle Fork Salmon River, especially as it pertains to fire for the purposes of this talk. Now, this is where the utility of wilderness landscapes really comes into play, because the Middle Fork Salmon River, located in the Frank Church River No Return Wilderness, offers large swaths of contiguous habitat, a well-connected stream network of habitats that are available to these fish, what you might consider multiple populations of these fish, depending on your bent. And looking at the relationship between the environment and these fish's population dynamics and their patterns of spatial occurrence over time can tell us something about habitat restoration and conservation in other areas. We'll skip that life cycle. So what I'm going to focus on are spawning reds in Chinook salmon. Chinook salmon spawn in nests that are called reds. You can see one right in the middle of the picture here, this little cleared area in the stream. If there was a fish in it, which is not really a fish there, but if I was going to pop one in, it might look like this, a fish spawning or occupying its red in the on the landscape. We can observe Chinook salmon spawning reds from outside of the stream in many of the habitats out west, stream habitats out west, because water clarity allows you to do it, and people have been doing it for decades. Usually from the stream side, although the data set I have, you can also count these from the air. You can note the helicopter shadow over here. I'm going to focus on the blue streams in this map here. This is a map of the Middle Fork Salmon River watershed. The blue streams are all streams that are accessible by Chinook salmon, large-bodied migratory Chinook salmon for spawning. So those are places where a red could be built. Now this is a large watershed. It's over 7,000 square kilometers in area. There are nearly 800 contiguous kilometers of stream that are accessible to Chinook salmon, many more of collecting tributaries above that. And 90% of this basin is in the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness. My co-author on this in this work, Russ Throw, has led a study of the distribution of spawning reds in this system. That's an aerial survey conducted once annually from 1995 through, I think 2018 was the last time it was done. Has yielded tens of thousands of reds counted over time. And as you can see, some heterogeneity, spatial heterogeneity and temporal heterogeneity. These are locations, each frame is a different year, in where those things are located. So we were interested in what environmental variables appear to drive that heterogeneity. And so now I'll give you the results in kind of an upside down format, because I want to end at fire. We conducted mixed effects logistic regression model to simply relate reaches that had spawning reds in them to the environmental variables that they that characterized them. And under contemporary conditions, we found some reasonably interesting but fairly predictable also results in some ways. There is spatially heterogeneous habitat quality throughout the basin, although this basin is generally very high in habitat quality. We noted a positive occurrence density relationship, which suggests that it's not full, that maybe there's room in this basin for more Chinook salmon, a good conservation point to have, and that there are benefits of natural processes, and including fire in this system. For the future, because we carried this probabilistic species occurrence model forward, is that there may be a cold water refugia sort of effect here where temperature doesn't matter so much, but flow reductions should really matter. And I'm actually really interested in Gabrielle's work now that I've been made aware of it, because the flow story in this system really is going to drive future occurrence of Chinook salmon. Here's just a picture of those forecasting results. You can see in red areas that are going to experience habitat loss. Many of them are, if you look at the plot next to it, are areas that are pretty high in Chinook salmon occurrence. So like there's habitat loss, quality loss to be had there. If we derive a habitat quantity summary for the basin, which we can do from these maps you see on the left, what I want to point out with this little table here is that we find by 2080, if we project stream flows and stream temperatures out into 2080, we find about a 25% loss in the habitat quantity that is available for Chinook salmon in this basin. And that's interesting because it does not include any sort of variation in fire. It just sort of carries forwards average conditions over the last couple decades. Whereas if we did something really ham-handed and like increase the standard the fire in every reach by 1 standard deviation, so in many reaches giving a little bit of fire where there was none, and others giving a little bit more where there was some, we can actually get back, at least under contemporary conditions, 6% of that habitat. And we haven't had we didn't have the information to carry forward any sort of spatial heterogeneity in those fire effects. So like a lot of what Sean talked about was really important, could be really important for predicting that in the basin. So it's good to have some leads there. Keep trying to advance and being stymied. Hey, look at that. So there was a fire effect. Well, here's a depiction of the fire histories in fire history for the Middle Fork Salmon River. Earlier years in blue, more recent in red. You can see if we were going to put our red locations on here, it might look like this. What we did was our fire effect was based on a proximity sort of algorithm. We took fire extents from the monitoring trends and burn severity data and calculated the area within 5 kilometers of the midpoint of any one reach that was also in the collecting watershed, and that we use that as a fire variable. So that is sort of what's depicted here. In the blue, you see a stream, and in orange, you see a fire extent, and in this sort of like this subset watershed polygon in black, the area of fire within which is what we're interested in. We hypothesized that we might have some same year negative effects of burned area, but over a longer time frame, maybe 5 years, there should be a positive effect. And we did actually find that. Here's just a depiction of what the data might look like for one specific reach. If the arrows are the occurrence of fires in some 1 kilometer reach of stream, our F5 variable, the 5-year burned area, would look like this little red polygon. We found something close to what we expected. That there's a very, very minimal, probably non-significant negative effect of fire on Chinook salmon red occurrence in the same year. But more importantly, in the 5-year sort of trailing window, there is a positive effect of fire on Chinook salmon. And that we found was very interesting. This is what drives that increase in habitat in the future should we elevate fires throughout the basin. Again, ham-handed and needs some biological nuance there. But we wonder why there's a link between reds and fire. So that brings us to debris flows. We think in this system that given two options for effects on Chinook salmon, they're either affected by geological processes that result from fire, i.e. debris flows, landslides and contribution of sediment from the landscape following fires, or by ecological factors. For instance, changes in nutrient composition of the water, changes in productivity, changes in species composition, either of the riparian zone or in stream itself. Anecdotal evidence shows that debris flows should be very important for Chinook salmon. And also being more or less migratory animals, much of their life cycle would mean that individuals don't really stick around for many of the ecological changes that may precipitate from fires. So we're interested in how debris flows could affect Chinook salmon, especially in comparison to our local fire variable that I just described. So we kind of need a long-term monitoring data set so we get some before and after conditions at sites. And we need some spatial replication to make sure that, any sort of pattern persists through that. Here's just an example of why we think debris flows matter. Here's an example of a new debris flow that Russ documented during his flights, which was followed pretty rapidly by 2 reds that were built on that sort of just a couple of years later, and in an area where there were no reds previously. This is actually the observation that motivated Russ to incorporate a new angle to the study, to this big red survey. So during aerial red surveys, Russ conducted a parallel study where he mapped the point locations of debris flows in 2 reaches of stream. And that's depicted here. On the left, if we zoom into a couple reaches on this red circle, you can see them right here. Over a period of time from 2003 to 2014, Russ was able to map debris flows and a couple of log jams in the middle, very large sort of stream spanning log jams that were, probably affected the habitat quality for salmon. Did it in the 2 replicate streams. These comprise 55 1 kilometer long reaches, which are our sort of units of replication through here. That we have paired red and debris flow occurrence for. During this time, there were 3 fires, 3 large fires, a couple of smaller ones in the extremes, in the extremities of the area, but it resulted in much of the area being burned by the end of it. And these fires occurred in 2000. These are the MTBS fire extents here that I'm picturing. 2000 and 2001 affected Pistol Creek, which you see up above here. And in 2007, a large fire affected most of this reach of the Middle Fork Salmon River main stem. We did something pretty simple. We took these data. We calculated a variable based on the occurrence of a debris flow in a reach. And we categorized the rest of the time after that within our time period as a post-fire condition. We provided a statistical model that's similar to the model we fit in the originating paper, and we added a fire by debris flow interaction term. So we tried to make the statistics as simple as possible to see whether or not fire or debris flow in this context dominated the variation in red occurrences, and whether the fire and debris flows may actually moderate each other's effect. What we find here mapped to the left is the map I presented earlier with the debris flows in green, fire extents in orange, and then reds in red during the study period. we find that debris flows do dominate the variation, the effect on the variation in red occurrence. Fire, our fire variable may have a small effect and a small positive effect, but that's marginally significant, probably non-significant. And there doesn't seem to be a fire by debris interaction here. So pretty interesting and suggestive that we should be really paying attention to these debris flows when thinking about fire's effect, at least on Chinook salmon. I am running out of time. So there are pretty big implications for the Middle Fork. One of them, especially in relation to Gabrielle's work, it is important to know what fire's influence might be in a system, because it seems as though the flow conditions are going to get worse for Chinook salmon and probably other species. Now we have a really big REDS data set, so it'd be nice to incorporate others. And yeah, and I'm out of time, so I'll just leave you with that, I guess. Can we get more debris flow data? Anybody?
All right, thanks, Greg. That was awesome. We're going to move on to our next speaker.
Thanks.
Hello. We're going to move on to our next speaker, Breezy Jackson. And I'll just point out, while Breezy's getting her slides up, that there's an opportunity to post questions and read answers in the Whova Q&A section. We have some discussion going on there, so another venue for engaging with the speakers. All right, Breezy, I'll just turn it over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you all for attending my talk, Responses of Stream-riparian Ecosystems to Fire in Central Idaho and Sierra Nevada Wilderness. Thanks to my co-author, Dr. Mashika Sullivan from The Ohio State University. Let me see, I got advanced slides. Okay, good to go. Thanks also to people, institutions, and funding sources that supported this work. Our understanding of the influence of fire on stream riparian ecosystems has largely been focused on abiotic attributes and populations of individual species over small spatial scales. However, the influence of fire extends to communities and ecosystems, where we may find short-term winners and losers when we look at fire effects at the population level and local scale. Heterogeneity created by fire likely benefits ecosystems as a whole and supports populations and communities over space and time, especially in a wilderness context where anthropogenic disturbance is minimized. Stream riparian food webs are functional attributes of these ecosystems that integrate changes in abiotic and biotic components through time and space. For example, streams in their riparian zones are connected through flows of water, nutrients, and food items. Leaf litter, terrestrial invertebrates, and other organic carbon sources provide food for stream organisms, while emergent aquatic insects provide food for terrestrial insectivores.
Breezy, can I ask you to lean closer to your microphone? We're having a little bit of a challenge hearing you, and I want to make sure our interpreters are able to hear you. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. This generates a bidirectional flux of energy connecting the two ecosystems, whereby allochthonous inputs of energy, nutrients, and food items are transported from the riparian zone into the stream, and autochthonous production by algae and other aquatic plants and microorganisms supports benthic invertebrate populations and eventual export of food items in the form of emergent aquatic insects. Fire may alter the relative magnitude of these fluxes. For example, fire may remove the riparian canopy, leading to decreases in allochthonous inputs to streams, while simultaneously increasing light penetration and autochthonous primary and secondary production, thereby shifting the balance of energy, nutrient, and food item fluxes between the two systems. We sought to examine the influence of fire on stream riparian food webs in two large wilderness areas. Our work took place in both the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness in central Idaho, following the 2000 Diamond Fire, and in Yosemite National Park in the central Sierra Nevada of California before and after the Rim Fire. Both landscapes experienced a removal of fire for at least a century due to a combination of suppression of cultural burning and land management policies. In Idaho, the Diamond Fire marked one of the first major fires since fire suppression policies were relaxed. In Yosemite, managers began relaxing fire suppression in the 1970s, but the rim fire was the largest fire in California history at the time. The Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness is the largest roadless area in the lower 48 states with 17,000 square kilometers of wilderness, not including adjacent wilderness areas. The elevation ranges from 600 to 3,000 meters above sea level, and land cover is comprised primarily of Douglas fir-dominated coniferous forests and native bunch grass. The climate is temperate with on average 40 centimeters of precipitation annually, mostly falling as snow in the winter. Our work was conducted out of the Taylor Wilderness Research Station located on Big Creek, which is a main tributary of the Middle Fork Salmon River. We chose 16 independent stream reaches that were unburned or burned with low or high severity by the 2000 Diamond Fire 5 years prior to our study. High severity burned stream reaches were characterized by removal of the conifer canopy by fire. Low severity reaches were burned, but the canopy remained intact. We compared structure and composition of riparian vegetation among the treatment groups, as well as comparing inputs of leaf litter and riparian invertebrates to the stream channel. High severity burned riparian forest had lower cover and was comprised of a different plant community compared to the unburned and low severity burned sites. MRPP comparison among treatments revealed no difference between riparian plant communities that were burned with low severity fire and those that were not burned. Furthermore, an important driver of the difference in plant community composition in high severity burned reaches was the proliferation of invasive grasses like cheatgrass and reed canary grass. We observed a concomitant decrease in alloxinous inputs of coniferous and deciduous leaf litter and high severity burned reaches. However, terrestrial invertebrate inputs were decreased in both low and high severity burned stream reaches, pointing toward a functional attribute not captured by measuring vegetation response alone. In a complementary study, Rachel Mallison and Colden Baxter found that high severity fire also stimulated an increase in benthic primary productivity as measured by chlorophyll A concentration, an increase in benthic insect biomass, an increase in emergent aquatic insect biomass, and an increase in riparian predator abundance, including spiders and bats. Therefore, in Idaho, we saw a confirmation of our prediction that high severity fire would decrease the importance of alloxiny and increase the importance of a toxinous production, at least at the reach scale 5 years following fire. This brings me to our Yosemite work. Yosemite has about 2,800 square kilometers of wilderness. The elevation ranges from 600 to 4,000 meters above sea level. Yosemite's fire-adapted forests are predominantly mixed conifer, comprised of pines, cedar, and oaks, and firs at higher elevations. The climate is Mediterranean type, with on average 90 centimeters annual precipitation, mostly falling as snow above 3,000 meters elevation. In Yosemite, we chose 12 independent stream reaches that were burned with high or low severity fire in the previous 12 years, and a reference reach that was unburned. We were also able to make before and after comparisons from the rim fire for a subset of our study locations. However, we recognize that besides severity, number of times burned, time since fire, and extent of fire within a catchment might also influence stream riparian food webs. So as you will see, we use fire predictors at the catchment scale as well as at the reach scale to predict stream riparian responses. We focused our studies in Yosemite on two riparian insectivores, the American dipper and the long-jawed orb weaver belonging to the family Tetragnathidae. Both specialize in preying on aquatic insects. The dipper forages along the stream bottom for larval insects as well as taking small fish, while tetragnathed spiders weave their webs directly above or adjacent to water bodies, catching aquatic insects as they emerge. In Yosemite, rather than measuring inputs and export of food items directly as we did in Idaho, our goal was to understand how fire may change the relative contribution of aquatic versus terrestrial primary productivity to food webs supporting these two top consumers, as well as to understand the complexity of the food web leading to each. We used stable isotopes of carbon to estimate the relative contribution of aquatic versus terrestrial carbon to consumers. Carbon isotope ratios are maintained up the food chain, so if algal and terrestrial plant sources have distinct carbon signatures, we can estimate the relative contribution of each to the food web leading to consumers. We use stable isotopes of nitrogen to estimate the trophic position of riparian consumers. Empirically, we know that there is about a 3.4 per mil difference in the ratio of N15 to N14 with each trophic step. So if we know the nitrogen signature of our basal resources and the signature of the consumer, we can, in essence, subtract one from the other, divide by 3.4 to estimate trophic position. There are multiple ways to describe food webs, and trophic position is one. Trophic position is the number of links between a basal resource and a single consumer. When that consumer is the top predator in a system, trophic position is also food chain length. Food chain length indicates the structure of food chains and is linked to resistance and resilience of food webs to disturbance. From theory, we can predict that ecosystem size, productivity, species interactions, and disturbance are drivers of food chain length. Empirically, all of these have been supported. In stream ecosystems in particular, flooding has emerged as an important driver of food chain length. We wanted to know if disturbance from fire would similarly affect food chain length. For spiders, we first compared density, reliance on aquatically derived energy, and trophic position among stream reaches burned with high or low severity in the 12 years prior to sampling. We found that there was no difference in riparian spider density or trophic responses between low and high severity burned reaches. We also found no shifts in these responses in a subset of streams following the rim fire. However, as I said before, we recognize the potential importance of fire effects at the catchment scale for driving food web responses at the reach scale. Therefore, we generated a fire variable from catchment level integration of fire severity, number of fires, and time since fire using principal components analysis to generate a fire axis. We then use model selection to compare fire, ecosystem size, productivity, and other sources of disturbance, for example, floods, for predicting spider trophic responses. We found that precipitation as a proxy for disturbance by floods and benthic invertebrate density, our productivity variable, were within 2 AICC units of the best model and considered most predictive of spider density. Similarly, for reliance on aquatically derived energy by spiders, precipitation alone predicted spider responses. However, fire at the catchment scale was predictive of trophic position of spiders along with productivity. Therefore, even when fire does not appear influential at the reach scale, catchment level variability and fire effects may influence food chain length, leading to riparian consumers. One unique attribute of stream ecosystems is that streams change size from headwaters to higher order downstream segments. We can predict from the river continuum concept that headwater stream food webs will be supplied through a loxony. That is, riparian primary production will provide most of the carbon or energy in the food web. However, in mid-order streams, food webs will be supplied by autochthony or primary production within the stream by algae and other aquatic photosynthetic organisms. Fire may disrupt these gradients by opening the riparian canopy, allowing for increased light penetration, and by shifting the primary consumer community in response to changes in channel geometry and sediments. Therefore, we measured spider trophic responses along the length of the Merced and South Fork Merced rivers from the headwaters to the park boundary. This represents a change in drainage area from 0.4 to 115 square kilometers. Once again, we use model selection to compare ecosystem size, productivity, flooding, and fire for predicting spider trophic responses. Spider reliance on aquatically derived energy ranged from 42 to 90% and trophic position from 1.75 to 3.99. Here we found that once again, disturbance related to precipitation and flooding, as well as ecosystem size and productivity, were well-supported predictors of reliance on aquatically derived energy and trophic position of spiders. And fire did not emerge as a supported predictor. However, when we plot our response variables against drainage area, triangles representing trophic position and stars representing reliance on aquatically derived energy, we see there is a change in the relationship between trophic position and drainage area from positive to negative that corresponds with a large spike in the proportion of the catchment affected by recent numerous or severe fires. We dug into this relationship using piecewise linear regression, and we found that the fire axis was at least as predictive of trophic position of spiders as drainage area with a much lower AIC score. This underscores the importance of considering fire at different scales and considering potential breakpoints in patterns created by fires, rather than only considering continuous relationships. Moving on to dippers. We identified 27 dipper territories across a range of stream sizes within both the Merced and Tuolumne watersheds. Similar to spiders, we wanted to compare the relative power of ecosystem size, productivity, and disturbance by fire and floods for predicting reliance on aquatically derived energy and trophic position of dippers. Dipper reliance on aquatically derived energy ranged from 33 to 82% and trophic position from 4.19 to 4.96. We found support for ecosystem size, precipitation, and fire for predicting trophic responses of dippers. Fire was associated with an increase in reliance on aquatically derived energy by dippers and a decrease in trophic position of dippers. Again, we noticed a pattern in the data that was not captured by model selection alone. In headwater streams, we found that fire was more predictive of dipper reliance on aquatically derived energy with a positive relationship, whereas in network streams, precipitation was more predictive, exhibiting a negative relationship. We interpret this as evidence that context, for example, whether you are working in a headwater versus network stream, is important when considering the impact of fire for shaping stream riparian ecosystems. So in summary, fire may change the magnitude and direction of fluxes of energy, nutrients, and food items between stream and riparian ecosystems. These shifts are heterogeneous over space and time, and upstream fire may affect downstream food webs. This heterogeneity is important for sustaining stream network level ecosystem function, biodiversity, and resistance and resilience to disturbances. Other ecological factors like ecosystem size, productivity, and floods may overshadow the influence of fire and stream riparian food webs. However, fire will interact with these factors, as we saw with Gabrielle's talk, and changes in food webs may be compounded. For example, post-fire precipitation largely determines whether changes to channel geometry and sedimentation occurs. Therefore, the holistic approach of using food webs to examine fire effects remains relevant. And I think we have a little time for questions.
We absolutely do. Thank you, Breezy, for that talk. So we'll give folks a moment to get questions into the chat or the Q&A and moved over onto this platform. I'll start us off with a question, and it's part summary to make sure, because I'm not a specialist in aquatic or riparian systems at all. But one of the emergent themes I see from your talk, Breezy, and please correct me if I'm misinterpreting this, is basically a shift in the balance of allochthonous versus autochthonous inputs into the aquatic or the stream system. And so, that's, I guess, my summary, and correct me if I'm misinterpreting that. But the question that follows is, do you have a sense of the absolute magnitude versus the relative balance of those two sources of primary productivity?
Yes, absolutely. So let's see here. If we look back a couple slides, say to dippers, for example, right? So this variable, reliance on aquatically derived energy, this tells us what proportion of the carbon in a dipper was originally fixed by algae rather than by a terrestrial plant. And there's some steps along the way in the food web to get there. But that tells us how important algae is in that food web that's leading from the stream into the dipper. And so we see this range, right? 33% to 82%. And this is a stunning result by itself, because stream ecosystems make up 2% of the landscape. And yet the primary producers in these streams are providing upwards of 82% of the carbon in this food web. And for dippers, that's less surprising than spiders, because they really are specializing on foraging in the stream bottom. But even so, right, the organisms that the dippers are feeding on, those benthic invertebrates, are integrating terrestrial and aquatic carbon sources in their diets. So it just really shows the importance of the stream. And so fire, right, can shift that balance and actually increase the importance of aquatic primary productivity. And I can't give you a before fire closed canopy state. I imagine it would be still in the 30 to 50% range, the importance of aquatic carbon. And then it just ramps way up. And in some places I've seen aquatic carbon making up 96%, 98% of the carbon in a stream riparian food chain.
After fire or just?
After fire.
Okay, wow. That's
It looks
incredible.
like we have a question that has just come in from Greg Jacobs. So I want to share. It says, Greg says, nice work, Breezy. Thinking about river network sites versus headwaters, what is the potential for nearby confluences with smaller streams to have an outsized influence on food webs and riparian ecology? Is there a way to measure the influence on those small closed streams?
Yeah, and actually, if I'm understanding your question correctly, one of Colton Baxter's graduate students actually looked at export of benthic invertebrates from headwater streams into network streams, and then also looked at foraging activity of salmonids at those confluences, and they found an increase in export of food items from burned headwater streams into network streams, and that there was an increase in salmonid foraging activity at those burned confluences. So I can chat you the paper afterwards.
Excellent. All right, thank you, Breezy, for that. And we're going to move on to our next speaker, our final speaker in this initial session or initial part of our special session. Gavin Jones from the Rocky Mountain Research Station is going to be speaking to us about managed wildfire and pyrodiversity and their relationship to spotted owl conservation in the Sierra Nevada of California. So Gavin, are you with us? There you are. Excellent. I'll just turn it over to you.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Yeah, thank you to Andrew and the others for inviting me to be a part of this symposium. And today I'm going to be talking about pyrodiversity and managed fire and how those elements support spotted owl conservation in the Sierra Nevada and California. And I just want to acknowledge my co-authors over at the University of Wisconsin, Anu Kramer, Rocky Gutierrez, and Zach Peary. So what is pyrodiversity? I'm going to be talking about that quite a bit. There's a lot of ways to think about pyrodiversity and define it, but simply put, it's the variation in fire effects across space or through time. And so this, looking here, this photo illustrates what I would call spatial pyrodiversity. We've got—
Yeah, I'm going to break in. We're not seeing your screen.
Okay.
I thought you might be going old school, but then you mentioned a photo.
Yeah, thanks. I'm glad I mentioned the photo. I actually—
There you go.
All right, we've got you now.
I forgot to hit share screen. I'm such a noob.
Oh, that's great.
All right, so pyrodiversity, again, it's this variation in fire effects across space or through time. This is a photo that I think illustrates pyrodiversity quite well, and that you've got patches of green forest that were unburned. This is an area that burned in the 2014 King Fire in the Sierra Nevada. So you got patches of green forest that were unburned, patches of really severely burned forest where you've just got sticks, and then you've got kind of moderately burned areas, and it's all kind of connected in this patchwork mosaic. It's really variable across space. So that this would be an area with high pyrodiversity. In contrast, turning from where that photo was taken just 90 degrees in a different direction, you get an area of really low pyrodiversity. So everything in a particular area experienced very similar fire effects across this large area, high severity fire in this case. And so, both high and low pyrodiversity can occur within a single fire event. That can occur across space and through time across different fire events as well. So what I'm going to be talking about today is the wildlife side of things. So how does pyrodiversity support biodiversity? And generally speaking, there's been some pretty strong evidence that at least in some systems, pyrodiversity does promote biodiversity. And there are several mechanisms that are hypothesized as to why this is the case. But one of those that I'll be talking about mostly in this talk is this idea of habitat complementation, that for a single species, you have multiple habitat types that are produced through a pyrodiverse fire or multiple fires occurring in a single area that produce sort of these variable vegetation conditions that may support different parts of the species life cycle or life history. But more broadly speaking, this third hypothesis here, the habitat heterogeneity hypothesis, this is the idea that biodiversity will generate different kinds of habitat for different species across the landscape and therefore support more species in general. So there's this evidence that biodiversity supports biodiversity. And also biodiversity promotes forest resilience, at least in dry forest ecosystems, like in the Sierra Nevada, which is where I'm going to be parking for the rest of the talk. Generally speaking, biodiversity, or fire variability or variation across a landscape produces more resilient landscapes through creating small, mid-scale, and large-scale variability on a landscape, which then reinforces, as Sean was talking in his first talk, can reinforce certain kinds of fire regimes, and in dry forests, maybe reinforcing sort of lower severity fire regimes that make forests that reinforce resilience to future disturbances. So biodiversity, it supports biodiversity. There's some evidence that supports forest resilience in some systems. But the question I'm going to ask today is could biodiversity harm specialist wildlife species? In particular, I like to think about this dichotomy between the black-backed woodpecker on the left, sort of a severe fire obligate, they're often thought of as such, and then on the right, the spotted owl, which is often thought of as a late cereal or old forest obligate. So the idea is, biodiversity in general is this vague concept, but sensitive species conservation is at the forefront of a lot of conservation issues. So could biodiversity, in a sense, limit or alter the specific habitat requirements of specialist species that tend to drive a lot of forest management decisions? Another sort of element here that I'm just going to bring in briefly is this idea of biodiversity. I think, I hypothesize, could help resolve some of the scientific uncertainty that exists, particularly surrounding the effects of fire and severe fire on spotted owls. This little schematic is just demonstrating this, the spotted owl populations have been declining in a lot of places. And we know that there's been a whole host of observed responses in the literature to fire and severe fire in particular, both good in terms of populations that remain stable or increase after fire, and bad, populations decrease following fire. So is severe fire good or bad for spotted owls is a big question that's been asked in recent years. And I think bringing in this idea of biodiversity may help resolve some of that uncertainty. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as I go through. So this is me catching a spotted owl or handling a spotted owl back in 2017 as part of a whole host of GPS tagging studies that myself and colleagues have been involved in, trying to understand specifically how the spotted owl is interacting with burned landscapes. And there's a couple of studies that we've published now in the past few years that really focus on this question of how spotted owls interact with burned landscapes. Three main study areas where we've looked at this question across two papers here that are cited on the right. One study occurred in the El Dorado and Tahoe National Forests, landscape that generally has limited fire use in management. And then two other landscapes, Yosemite and Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks down in the southern Sierra Nevada, where the fire use has really been quite active and integrated into management policies for almost 50 years, or I guess 50 years now. So really different landscapes in terms of their fire histories and fire use. And we were interested in understanding how spotted owls responded in terms of their movements and habitat selection to wildfire across these different landscapes. And so this just gives you a sense of our coverage and the amount of fire that has occurred in these different landscapes. This top study here on the national forests primarily was looking at the effects of the 2014 King Fire, which is this darker color here. And each cluster of dots is an individual spotted owl, and there's a whole bunch of them here. And then these are other, this is in Yosemite in the center and Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Parks in the south. You see a lot of fire happening in Yosemite, primarily smaller fires. And then these are our owls that we tagged. And across those two studies, there's really one conclusion that we've arrived at that's really consistent and strong. It's that the way that spotted owls interact with severely burned forests is entirely conditional on the size and configuration of that severe fire patch. And so this is just two really, I think, good examples of owls that demonstrate this selection pattern. So these are these plus marks, the yellow symbols here. These are spotted owl GPS tagging locations throughout the breeding season. Looking at aerial imagery here, fire boundary in this kind of grayed out color. And then everything that's red, shaded red here, is severely burned forest, or areas that experience greater than 75% canopy mortality. And you see this owl here absolutely hammered this small patch of severely burned forest. So actually really liked it and spent a lot of time there. And we know it was spending time foraging there. And so, this is clearly very important for this bird, using severely burned forest. And on the other hand, this owl on the right pretty much entirely avoided this large severely burned patch, but used some of these smaller patches near its nesting area. And so the importance of severe fire patch size can't be overstated. We've also been looking at the larger population level effects of fire. And so this is an example of the 2014 King Fire, which is a natural experiment. We had pre-fire, 20 years of pre-fire data, 6 years of post-fire data, areas that burned and didn't burn. So we had the control and the impact. And what we found is that following this 2014 King Fire, the spotted owl territories that burned most severely, greater than 50% of their territory area burning severely, essentially went extinct right away and remained extinct for 6 years following the fire. So no owls remained in sort of this central burned patch you see here, where there were previously some pretty consistent and productive spotted owl sites. Whereas on the other hand, sites that burned, that experienced some severe fire tended to remain relatively stable in terms of the number of them that were occupied. That's what this y-axis here, the proportion of these sites on the left here that remained occupied. So we've got, pretty stable for both the sites that burned a little bit at high severity and the sites that were completely unburned. So really it's those most severely burned sites that experienced the steep drop off. In terms of the drivers of those changes, following the King Fire, the local persistence probability, so the likelihood that a site would remain occupied, it decreased when you had more high severity fire. It increased with greater pyrodiversity, or a greater mixture of burn severities within the territory. And there was no effective post-fire salvage logging. And a similar results for colonization probability. So the likelihood that an unoccupied site would become occupied following the fire decreased with high severity fire. The amount of high severity fire in a territory increased with pyrodiversity, and again, no effective salvage logging. So just to drill this home a little bit, this is what I call the tale of two territories. So these are two territories on our study area that were exactly the same in terms of their pre-fire predicted quality, or the likelihood that they were occupied by owls, 0.86. It's just a measure of, you can think about it as kind of a measure of habitat quality. Following the fire, the top territory here, it stayed about, it dropped a little bit from 0.86 to 0.76, but still had relatively high predicted occupancy. This other territory on the bottom went all the way down to 0.07, really low predicted occupancy. So besides these aerial images, what's the difference between the two territories? And it's really about pyrodiversity. This top territory here, this is all these different colors are different burn severity classes. The black color is salvage logged. So you can see this top territory had a really nice mixture of burn severities. This territory remained occupied all 6 years following the King Fire. And this site on the bottom remained unoccupied for all 6 years following the King Fire, and mostly burned at high severity, very little mixture of burn severity in there. Just a side note, this is not my research, but I do want to talk just briefly as I laid out that dichotomy between the black-backed woodpecker and the spotted owl. Some research by some colleagues of mine that really demonstrate the other side of the story too. Blackback woodpeckers, you will often hear that they need big burned areas, and that the more high severity fire, the better. There are these high severity fire obligates. In a sense, that is true, but more recent research has scratched the surface of that oversimplified characterization and demonstrated that they're actually not very abundant, and they've been detected in quite low numbers following some of these more recent megafires. So this is a 2013 rim fire here. Some work by Angela White and colleagues showed that there were very few detections of blackback woodpeckers in this extreme wildfire. There's also, they looked at the King Fire as well, very little detections. All these white dots and triangles here, these are surveys that were done. The white ones is where they didn't detect anything. And so you might predict that this place would be flooded with blackbacks after the rim fire, but as a matter of fact, there were very few there. So what's the reason for that? And some other work by Morgan Tingley and led by Andrew Stillman, who's Morgan Tingley's grad student at UConn, found that really the underlying mechanism potentially for these types of responses by blackbacks is that the fledgling stage, so juvenile blackback woodpeckers require green forest. They need to be hanging out in places where they can find cover in green forest. So they don't, you can't just be out in the middle of a burned patch. You're going to get predated and eaten. So you got to hang out by this green forest. The adults, on the other hand, they prefer the high severity stuff, but they typically stay on the edge of those patches. And so in general, pyrodiversity it may explain some of these patterns in megafires for blackback woodpeckers as well. So thinking about pyrodiversity as a management paradigm. So if we're to use this paradigm and think about how it may guide fire and forest management, I think there's a number of benefits that this pyrodiversity framing could bring. The first is that it supports dry forest ecosystem resilience, getting more fire on the ground, creating more heterogeneity on the landscape through fire is going to support that ecosystem resilience. It'll sustain ecosystem services in terms of hydrology and water quality, clean air and all that kind of stuff. It will support biodiversity more broadly, as we learned from the biodiversity hypothesis, which is well supported in the Sierra Nevada. And also promotes habitat for those key species of concern, like the blackback woodpecker and the spotted owl. So this is a depiction of sort of two options for dry forest landscapes. We can sort of have this nice fire restored landscape, similar to the Illilouette Basin, as Gabrielle was describing, or we can have these highly stocked, overdense forests that burn up and end up sort of, it's a lose-lose for many of our management priorities. So take-home points here. The first, that thinking about how spotted owls interact with severely burned forests, you can't understand that question or that issue without thinking about patch size and configuration of those patches. So small, complex patches are good for spotted owls. They like those kinds of severely burned patches, but not the big ones. Second, we found that large patches of severe fire, it suppressed recolonization for a 6-year post-fire period. So big severe fire is not recolonized for up to 6 years after the fire, as far as we've studied so far. Third is that pyrodiversity promoted territory persistence for spotted owls after a megafire, and that a pyrodiversity paradigm could help unify management objectives in multi-use landscapes. So with that, I'll say thank you so much for listening, and may have a few minutes for questions.
Great. Thank you, Gavin. You are correct. We've got about, I'll say, 1 minute for questions. So if anybody wants to get in a quick question, you can pop it into the chat.
Andrew, it looks like we have one that just came in from Leela Duchak, who says, "Hi, Gavin, great presentation. Can you talk a little more about salvage logging? Do you think the size, previous condition, or location of those logged areas may explain why you didn't see salvage logging affecting spotted owl colonization?"
Yeah, thanks, Layla. Hey, Layla. Yeah, thanks for the question. In our particular study, we found no effects of salvage logging. It was very clear. And we tried many different ways to see if we could detect that effect, and we just couldn't. And the point in our study is that the severe fire extent was so large and so, comprehensive, it just burned across, 100% of owl territories in many cases. The relative effects of salvage logging were just so minuscule, if anything, that we weren't able to detect those effects. We have 400 hectares of severely burned standard placing fire in a territory. You've got 10 or 20 hectares of areas that were salvage logged. The magnitude is just so different that those effects weren't detected. I will say, there's plenty of evidence out there that salvage logging can have deleterious effects to owls. It just depends on where it's done and whether owls are still there. and in our case, the places where salvage logging occurred tended to occur in places where there were no owls, and there were not going to be owls for probably the next 100 years because of the conditions of the burn there. So if you study a different fire in a different context, you might be able to detect those effects depending on where that salvage logging occurs and how extensive it is. So good question. Hopefully that helped get at your answer a little bit.
We're out of time, so thank you, Gavin, for that presentation and the great question and answer there. I want to thank all of our speakers for presenting and sharing their research with us this morning, and I want to invite everyone back. We're going to continue this session in 20 minutes right after the break. We have a lineup of 4 more speakers and some time for discussion and synthesis at the end. So thanks, everyone, and I hope to see you in 20 minutes.